I was sitting in that cramped train carriage somewhere between London and Manchester when Anthony Barrett first told me about her. The way his weathered hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, the way his voice caught when he said her name, Manatsanan. I should have known right then that this story would end in disaster. But Anthony was my oldest friend. And when a man in his mid-50s starts talking about love with the desperation of a drowning person grasping at driftwood, you listen. You listen, even when every instinct screams that what you're hearing will destroy him. Before we dive into this story that changed everything for Anthony, I need you to do something. If you're someone who believes in second chances, in love conquering all odds, hit that subscribe button, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about trust, about hope, and about how far a lonely heart will go to feel whole again. Anthony Barrett was not the kind of man you'd expect to fall victim to anything, let alone a romance scam orchestrated halfway across the world. He was a structural engineer, methodical and precise, the kind of person who double-checked calculations and never made impulsive decisions. He had built bridges that would stand for generations, designed foundations that could weather any storm. But when his wife Margaret died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him alone in their empty house in Bristol, Anthony discovered that all his engineering expertise couldn't build a bridge across the chasm of grief that had opened in his chest. The loneliness ate at him like rust on steel. His brother David, younger by 5 years and infinitely more cynical about human nature, watched Anthony's slow decline with growing concern. David had seen what isolation could do to a man. He worked in fraud prevention for a major bank, spending his days unraveling the elaborate lies people told themselves and others for money. He tried to get Anthony out, tried to introduce him to women their age, tried to convince him to take up hobbies, travel, do anything except sit in that house surrounded by Margaret's photographs and the ghost of their 30-year marriage. That's when Anthony discovered the internet dating sites, not the mainstream ones where divorced professionals in their 50s looked for companionship and shared interests. No, Anthony somehow found his way to the international sites, the ones where Western men connect with women from Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, sites where loneliness meets desperation in a marketplace of broken dreams and carefully crafted lies. Manatsanan's profile picture showed a woman in her early 30s with long black hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness and wisdom. She worked as a nurse in Surat Thani, a province in southern Thailand. She had lost her husband in a motorcycle accident 2 years earlier and was raising her 8-year-old daughter alone. She wasn't looking for money, her profile said. She was looking for genuine connection, for someone who understood loss and could appreciate the simple joys of building something real together. Anthony stared at that photograph for 3 hours before sending his first message. He told me later that something about her smile reminded him of Margaret. Not physically, but in the way it seemed to promise safety, understanding, acceptance. He wrote a careful, respectful message introducing himself, mentioning his own loss, his work, his hope for companionship. He expected nothing. He sent it at 2 in the morning and fell asleep at his computer. When he woke up 6 hours later, she had already replied. The message was perfect, too perfect, though Anthony couldn't see it then. Manatsanan wrote about her grief, about the challenges of single motherhood in Thailand, about her belief that love could transcend distance and cultural differences. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, about his life in England, about his dreams for the future. She shared pictures of her daughter, a beautiful child with her mother's eyes, always smiling despite their difficult circumstances. Their correspondence began innocently enough. Daily emails that gradually became twice daily, then constant messaging throughout Anthony's waking hours. Manatsanan worked night shifts at the hospital, she explained, which made their time zones almost perfectly aligned. She could chat with Anthony during her breaks, send him pictures of the sunrise over the mountains near Surat Thani, share stories about her patients and her daughter's achievements in school. But here's where I need you to pause this story and think carefully. As someone who watched this unfold from the beginning, I started noticing things that Anthony missed completely. Take a moment, write in the comments below. What already seems suspicious about Manatsanan's story? What details don't quite add up? Because if you can spot the red flags now, you might save someone you care about from Anthony's fate. The first crack in Anthony's skeptical armor came when Manatsanan began sharing more personal details about her life. Her husband hadn't just died in an accident. He had been the sole breadwinner, and his death left her with crushing medical debt from his final weeks in intensive care. The hospital where she worked barely paid enough to cover rent and food, let alone her daughter's school fees or the medications her daughter needed for a chronic respiratory condition. Anthony found himself staying up later and later, waiting for her messages, refreshing his email every few minutes. When she didn't respond immediately, she never asked for money directly, but she painted vivid pictures of their struggles: the leaking roof during monsoon season, the broken refrigerator that spoiled their food, the school threatening to expel her daughter for unpaid fees, the way her daughter cried when she couldn't afford the medicine that helped her breathe easier at night. David noticed the change in his brother immediately. Anthony, who had been methodical about everything since Margaret's death, eating at the same times, maintaining the same routines, keeping the same social schedule, suddenly became erratic. He cancelled dinner plans to chat with Manatsanan. He started learning basic Thai phrases. He bought books about Thai culture and Buddhism. He talked about Manatsanan constantly, sharing screenshots of her messages, showing pictures of her daughter to anyone who would look. Then came the first request, not for money. Manatsanan was too sophisticated for such crude tactics. Instead, she mentioned that her phone was dying. The screen cracked from a fall at work, and she was saving money to replace it. But it would take months. She was embarrassed to mention it, she said. But sometimes she couldn't respond to Anthony's messages for hours because the phone would randomly shut down, and she worried he would think she was losing interest. Anthony transferred £300 that same day, not much money for a successful engineer, barely noticeable in his monthly budget. Manatsanan's gratitude was overwhelming. She sent pictures of the new phone, videos of her daughter thanking Uncle Anthony in broken English, promises that she would pay him back as soon as possible, though they both knew that wasn't realistic given her salary. The requests came slowly, carefully spaced apart, always accompanied by elaborate explanations and genuine emergencies. Her daughter's inhaler prescription increased in price. The landlord demanded 3 months' rent in advance, or they would be evicted. A patient at the hospital accused Manatsanan of stealing medication, and she needed money for a lawyer to clear her name and keep her nursing license. Each crisis was perfectly timed, always arriving just when Anthony was beginning to feel secure in their relationship. Each request was modest enough to seem reasonable, urgent enough to require immediate action, and heart-wrenching enough to make refusal feel like cruelty. Anthony began checking his bank balance obsessively, not because he was worried about money, but because he wanted to make sure he could help when the next emergency arose. 6 months into their relationship, Manatsanan suggested they meet in person. She had saved enough money for a bus ticket to Bangkok, where Anthony could fly into Suvarnabhumi Airport. She painted romantic pictures of their reunion, walking hand in hand through the floating markets, watching the sunset from a riverside restaurant, introducing Anthony to her daughter and showing him the Thailand that tourists never see. But 3 weeks before Anthony's planned trip, disaster struck. Manatsanan's daughter was hospitalized with a severe asthma attack that progressed into pneumonia. The child was in intensive care, and the medical bills were mounting by the day. Worse, Manatsanan had to take unpaid leave from work to stay by her daughter's bedside, cutting off their only income stream. The hospital was threatening to transfer the child to a lower quality facility if they couldn't pay the treatment costs. Anthony didn't hesitate. He transferred £8,000, nearly half of his emergency savings. Manatsanan's relief and gratitude poured through his computer screen in messages filled with tears and promises. She sent pictures from the hospital, showing her daughter connected to breathing machines, looking tiny and vulnerable in the adult-sized bed. She sent voice messages where he could hear the sounds of hospital equipment in the background, her voice breaking as she thanked him for saving her daughter's life. The planned trip to Thailand was postponed indefinitely while her daughter recovered. Anthony understood completely. A child's health came before everything else. He began researching international medical insurance, looking into the possibility of bringing both Manatsanan and her daughter to England, where they could access the National Health Service. He started the preliminary paperwork for a fiancé visa, but David's suspicions had been growing for months. As someone who investigated financial fraud professionally, he recognized the patterns that Anthony's heart refused to see: the carefully orchestrated crises, the emotional manipulation, the way each request built logically on the previous ones to establish a pattern of need and gratitude. He tried talking to Anthony directly, presenting evidence he had found online about romance scams targeting middle-aged Western men, showing statistics about fraud originating from Southeast Asia. Anthony's response was explosive. He accused David of racism, of jealousy, of being unable to understand what real love looked like. How dare David question Manatsanan's character when she had shared her most vulnerable moments, trusted Anthony with her deepest fears, opened her heart despite the risk of being hurt again. The brothers had their worst fight in 40 years, ending with Anthony storming out of David's house and refusing to speak to him for weeks. During those weeks of silence between the brothers, Manatsanan's requests grew larger and more frequent. Her daughter needed specialized treatment that wasn't available in Thailand. Her landlord was selling the building, and she needed money for a deposit on a new apartment. Her own health began failing under the stress, and she needed surgery that her insurance wouldn't cover. Anthony liquidated his investment accounts. He took a loan against his house. He started working overtime, picking up consulting projects on weekends, anything to increase his income flow. when his bank flagged the international transfers as potentially fraudulent and froze his accounts. Anthony felt betrayed by an institution he had trusted for decades. He opened new accounts at different banks, spreading the transfers around to avoid triggering more security measures. 12 months after that first email, Anthony had sent Manatsanan over £40,000. His savings were gone, his retirement fund depleted, his house mortgaged to the maximum allowable amount. But he had something more valuable than money. He had love, purpose, and the promise of a new family who needed him. Manatsanan's messages had become the highlight of his day. Her voice notes the last thing he heard before sleep, and the first thing he listened to upon waking. Then came the message that should have changed everything. Manatsanan's daughter had recovered enough to return to school, and Manatsanan herself had been promoted to head nurse at the hospital. They finally had enough financial stability to plan for the future. She was ready to apply for a tourist visa to visit England, to meet Anthony in person and begin building their life together. The visa application required proof of financial support, she explained. Anthony would need to send an additional £15,000 to a special government account that would demonstrate her ability to support herself during the visit and guarantee her return to Thailand. The money would be returned once her visa was approved, and she completed her trip, minus administrative fees. It was standard procedure, according to the visa consultant she had hired in Bangkok. Anthony emptied the last of his accessible accounts and sent the money without hesitation. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, planning for, sacrificing for. In just a few weeks, he would hold Manatsanan in his arms, meet her daughter, begin the next chapter of his life. He bought new clothes, deep cleaned his house, researched Thai restaurants in Bristol, where he could take her for their first dinner together on English soil. Let me pause here again to ask you something, and please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen someone you cared about fall victim to a scam like this? How did you handle it? Did they listen to your warnings, or did love make them deaf to reason? Because what happened next will break your heart. But maybe your experiences can help someone else who's watching their loved one walk into the same trap. 2 weeks before Manatsanan's supposed arrival, everything unraveled in the span of a single day. David, who had been quietly conducting his own investigation despite their estrangement, appeared at Anthony's door with a thick folder of evidence, bank records showing that the account Anthony had been sending money to belonged to a criminal organization operating multiple romance scams across Europe and North America. Screenshots of the same photos Manatsanan had been sending, found on dozens of other dating profiles, using different names and stories. Evidence that the voice messages had been generated using artificial intelligence, created by feeding real Thai women's voices into software that could make them say anything. The most devastating revelation came last. David had hired a private investigator in Thailand who had tracked down the real woman in Manatsanan's photographs. Her name was actually Siripon. She was married with 3 healthy children, and she worked as a teacher in Chiang Mai, over 600 kilometers from Surat Thani. She had no idea her photographs were being used to defraud lonely men around the world. The investigator showed her Anthony's picture and messages. She had never seen him before in her life. Anthony stared at the evidence for what felt like hours, his hands shaking as he turned page after page of documentation that destroyed every assumption he had built his new life around. The woman he loved didn't exist. The child he had been helping to save was a fiction. Every moment of joy, every surge of purpose, every dream of redemption and second chances, all of it had been manufactured by criminals who had studied his psychology like an engineering blueprint and found the exact points where pressure could be applied to make the structure collapse. The confrontation with reality hit Anthony like a physical blow. He called the phone number he had been texting for over a year, the number that had delivered thousands of messages from the woman he thought he knew. A man answered, speaking rapid Thai, clearly annoyed at being disturbed. When Anthony stammered out Manatsanan's name, the man laughed and hung up. Anthony tried calling back dozens of times, but the number had been disconnected. His emails bounced back. Her social media profiles had vanished. The dating site where they met claimed no record of her account. In the span of a few hours, Anthony watched an entire relationship, an entire world, simply cease to exist, as if it had never been real in the first place. The emotional devastation was immediate and complete. Anthony had not just lost money, he had lost his sense of identity, his ability to trust his own judgment, his faith in the possibility of love and redemption. The grief he felt was worse than losing Margaret, because Margaret's death had been real. Their marriage had been real. Their memories together had substance and weight. This loss felt like waking up from a dream, only to discover that the dream had been all that was keeping you alive. David found his brother 3 days later, sitting in his empty house surrounded by printed emails and photographs, staring at his phone as if it might suddenly deliver the message that would make everything make sense again. Anthony hadn't eaten, hadn't bathed, hadn't even turned on the lights when darkness fell. He looked like a man who had died but forgotten to stop breathing. The practical consequences were almost as devastating as the emotional ones. Anthony owed more money than he could pay. His house was remortgaged to the point where the monthly payments consumed most of his salary. His retirement fund was gone. His credit cards were maxed out. At 56 years old, he was essentially starting over financially, but without the energy or optimism that might make such a restart possible. The legal authorities were sympathetic but ultimately helpless. The money had been transferred through a complex network of international accounts designed specifically to make recovery impossible. The criminals behind the scam were likely operating from countries with minimal cooperation with British law enforcement, assuming they could even be identified and located. Anthony's case was added to a database of similar victims, but he was told not to expect any meaningful recovery of his losses. But something unexpected happened during those dark weeks of financial and emotional reckoning. David, who had been right about everything, but had taken no satisfaction in being proven correct, moved into Anthony's house temporarily to help manage the crisis. Other friends began reaching out, people who had been quietly worried about Anthony for months, but hadn't known how to approach the subject. Margaret's sister offered to help with the financial planning. A colleague from work connected Anthony with a therapist who specialized in fraud victims. What Anthony discovered, slowly and painfully, was that his isolation had been as much a part of the scam as the fake emergencies and manufactured crises. The criminals had deliberately driven a wedge between him and his support network, making him dependent on their fictional relationship for emotional sustenance. They had studied his vulnerabilities, his grief, his loneliness, his desire to be needed, and crafted a perfect trap designed specifically for his psychology. The healing process was neither quick nor linear. Some days, Anthony felt angry, furious at the criminals who had stolen from him, but also angry at himself for being so gullible, so desperate, so easily manipulated. Other days brought waves of shame so intense he couldn't leave the house. The knowledge that David had tried to warn him, that the signs had been obvious to everyone except him, felt like salt in an open wound. But gradually, with professional help and the support of people who cared about him, Anthony began to rebuild not just his finances, but his understanding of what had happened to him. He learned that romance scams were a multi-billion-dollar industry targeting millions of victims worldwide. He learned that the criminals behind these operations were sophisticated professionals who studied psychology, social engineering, and cultural vulnerabilities with the dedication of PhD researchers. He learned that being victimized didn't make him weak or stupid. It made him human. 6 months after the scam was exposed, Anthony did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He began volunteering with a charity that helped romance scam victims, sharing his story with other people who had fallen into similar traps. He discovered that helping others navigate their own recovery gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since Margaret's death. Through the charity work, Anthony met Sarah, a woman in her early 50s who had lost 30,000 pounds to a scammer pretending to be a widowed American soldier stationed in Afghanistan. Sarah's experience had been different in the details, but identical in the emotional architecture. The careful building of trust, the manufactured crises, the isolation from friends and family who might have seen through the deception. Their relationship developed slowly, built on a foundation of shared experience and mutual understanding rather than desperate loneliness and manufactured romance. They were both cautious, both scarred, both hyper-aware of the red flags they had missed in their previous relationships. But they were also both committed to healing, to learning, to building something real on the ruins of what had been false. Anthony never fully recovered financially from his losses. He had to sell his house and move into a smaller apartment. His retirement was delayed by at least a decade, but he discovered something that surprised him. He didn't miss the money as much as he had expected. What he missed, what he had always been missing since Margaret's death, was not financial security, but human connection. The scam had taught him the difference between authentic relationship and manufactured emotional dependency. 2 years later, Anthony married Sarah in a small ceremony attended by both their families, including David, who had become not just Anthony's brother again, but his closest friend and most trusted advisor. The wedding was simple, practical, utterly without illusion, and more meaningful to Anthony than any of the elaborate romantic fantasies that Manatsanan had painted in her messages. As I finished telling you this story, sitting in that same train carriage where Anthony first shared his heartbreak with me, I want you to understand something crucial. This is not a story about love conquering all, or about second chances, or about happy endings. This is a story about the difference between love and need, between connection and exploitation, between the hope that heals and the hope that destroys. Anthony's story could have ended in suicide, bankruptcy, or permanent isolation. Many similar stories do, but it ended instead with hard-earned wisdom, authentic relationships, and the kind of cautious optimism that can only come from surviving complete devastation and choosing to rebuild anyway. If you know someone who might be vulnerable to this kind of scam, someone recently divorced, widowed, or simply lonely, share this story with them, not to frighten them away from love, but to help them recognize the difference between someone who loves them and someone who loves what they can provide. The difference between someone who wants to build a life with them and someone who wants to extract value from their vulnerabilities. And if you're someone who has fallen victim to a similar scam, know this: you're not alone, you're not stupid, and your story is not over. The shame belongs to the criminals who stole from you, not to you for being human enough to hope for love. Recovery is possible, authentic connections are possible, and the wisdom you gain from surviving this experience has value that extends far beyond your personal healing. Before you move on with your day, I want you to do something. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, because there are too many Anthony Barretts in the world, and too many people who need to hear these stories before they become one themselves. And leave a comment below. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between hope and skepticism, between trust and caution. Tell me about the red flags you've learned to recognize, or the support you've given to someone who couldn't see the danger they were walking into. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to avoid Anthony's fate, or to begin their own recovery if they're already trapped in a similar situation. The criminals who run these scams count on our silence, on our shame, on our isolation. They count on us being too embarrassed to share our stories, too proud to ask for help, too afraid of judgment to warn others. Every time we speak openly about these experiences, every time we choose transparency over privacy, we make their job a little bit harder and make the next potential victim a little bit safer. So subscribe, comment, and share this story, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear Anthony's story before it becomes their own. And somewhere else, someone who's living through their own version of Anthony's nightmare needs to know that recovery is possible, that they're not alone, and that their story, like his, doesn't have to end in devastation. The most important lesson Anthony learned, the one that saved his life and made his recovery possible, was this: real love doesn't isolate you from the people who care about you. Real love doesn't require you to choose between your heart and your judgment. Real love doesn't ask you to prove your devotion through financial sacrifice, or to demonstrate your trust by ignoring obvious inconsistencies. Real love, Anthony discovered, feels nothing like the desperate addiction that had driven him to send £40,000 to a stranger. Real love feels like safety, like coming home, like being known and accepted for exactly who you are, rather than what you can provide. It took losing everything he thought he wanted to discover what he actually needed. And that, perhaps, is the most hopeful part of this entire devastating story.